Arnold, just to give you an idea that in Africa we have so many highly, very, very rich in mineral resources. And the issue with the African continent is that we still don't have extensive access into these resources. If you could think that we could access them, how much that would contribute to our economic development. So when we're talking about that gap in infrastructure, we're really talking about how do we access those minerals. And what we find governments and private investment is doing more cleverly is how can we link that mining-related infrastructure with other commercial aspects, and also infrastructure that helps the community, so that we get commuter rail linking on the same line as you would say for an iron ore rail. So that link is actually going to really help us open up new mineral resources right across the continent.
Right. Often when governments, when there's talk of maybe investing in a particular area because maybe there's prospects for minerals and unveiling them, you do get the sense from many governments that they will only invest in infrastructure development if there is a guarantee from their end that this area is particularly mineral rich, or it has some platinum, or it has some oil. How do you strike this status quo and have the private sector and the government actually come to the table here, regardless of whether or not there's been any findings?
Well, I think what's really fundamental is, first of all, that you have to prove that if you are going to do a mining development or an oil and gas development around infrastructure, I think the most important thing is there has to be a resource. Okay? So from an investment point of view, they are looking for that resource. But I think what we find, and we are hoping to continue to find, is where you start linking up not only the natural resource, but also farming-related resources. So when you're looking at agriculture, oil and gas, which, as you know, is really taking a big boom up on the east coast of Africa, but in mining, it's talking back to mining specifically, where almost every country in Africa has mining resources, and there's a huge growing demand for agriculture. This now becomes, now we're reaching capacity where we can actually go, all right, private developers, we're looking for some component contribution to this, but the government can actually see benefit from that as well if you use multi-use.
Doctor, a question that has been baffling me for quite a few years is the cost of exploration is just astronomical, you know, and there's no guarantee that you're going to find anything.
Correct.
You know, the likes of Heritage have been drilling in East Africa for decades, and they haven't found it. Well, they only found something in Uganda. If there's no guarantee that you're finding anything, how do you address this, at least from the government, and even make it commercial, make a business sense?
Okay, so from an exploration point of view, yes, there's always some degree of risk, but every business has some degree of risk, right? Yeah. I think with new technologies, actually part of the key to the success of the story, you really do need to do, instead of going in and doing a very detailed exploration, what we end up doing now, and increasingly so, is actually use a combination of satellite techniques as well as remote sensing to be able to at least narrow in on where our resources are. And in fact, what perhaps would be contributing from a government point of view is to work to try and get some of those high-level resource evaluations done, so you know more or less where to concentrate. And in many cases, in West African countries and in Southern Africa, that's already available. Some degree of targeting is possible. Yeah.
Right. Let's talk about the capacity, because this is another huge gap that we are seeing across the continent. Oftentimes when the likes of CNOOC or Shell are coming into many of these countries, you see a band of foreign nationals actually being brought into the respective countries.
Yes, this is a very important thing.
I mean, I want to ask you, I want to put you on the spot here,
That's all right.
At least from your end, how could this be addressed?
Talk about capacity building?
Yes.
Within the capability of the population to meet the skills demand?
Because we all know that a university education in your line of work is quite expensive to start with.
Yes, it is very expensive to start off with. I think capacity building is a challenge that we're facing everywhere in the world, and particularly in parts of Africa. I think that both the private sector and the governments have done quite a few tangible steps as to how we can actually build that capacity. And that's been everything from requiring a degree of investment from legislation, if you are going to access a resource, to having mentorship programs, which are mandatory if you are going to bring in expats with that experience. You want to leave a heritage legacy behind. Yep. And I want to just talk a little bit about South Africa, where we actually have a huge amount of capacity, right? We've trained, and we continue to train highly skilled professionals in South Africa in particular. And I think one of the aspects that really positions us really well to deliver skills into the rest of the continent is that South Africans tend to be quite innovative and really good at problem solving, and this combined with really good education, good quality, good standards in our universities, and also I guess a heritage of mining. We're a mining country, right?
150 years, yeah.
Yes, puts us in a really good position to be competitive against the foreign nationals coming from particularly Australia and Canada who are investing heavily in Africa at the moment.
Let alone countries that are just making discoveries, mineral
correct.
discoveries to start with in this particular decade. Of course, we cannot go on about this without tackling the environmental issue.
Yes.
There's a lot of irresponsible mining out there, be it just shacks and individuals doing the mining, to even the big boys. You know,
Yes.
the likes of Shell in Nigeria. I've seen some very scary examples there. Do you get the sense that maybe the governments do not have enough power to talk to these the big MNCs and tell them, you know what, this is wrong? At the end of the day, do they actually have the power?
That's a very tricky question and quite a difficult one to answer. So I'm going to do my very best on that answer. It's the legislation in many of our countries, particularly in East Africa and in West Africa at the moment, is quite advanced and has recently been upgraded to international standards. The legislation is quite good and continuing to improve. The challenge, I think, most countries new to these huge developments have is implementation. How do we watchdog it?
Yeah.
And which is to your point. I think one of the things that is almost to the advantage of international investment is when you have an international development agency really provides a second requirement to improve the environmental concerns. That's right from how you set up your business in the beginning, how you set it up, make sure you do the correct environmental impact assessments, and then the methods in which you're going to actually control the risk of contamination. And I think possibly the most importantly is making sure you have enough money for closure, to plan for closure right at the very beginning, because as much as we like to think these resources will be there forever, they are finite.